The halls of Westminster fell silent. Every eye turned as King Charles III rose from his seat, his face etched with an expression no one had seen before. What happened next would send shockwaves through the entire British establishment. This wasn't just another political disagreement. This was the moment when centuries of tradition collided with modern governance, and Prime Minister Keir Starmer found himself trapped in a confrontation he never saw coming. The King had had enough, and what he revealed in those next few moments would change everything. The tension had been building for months, but nobody expected it to explode like this. Behind the gilded doors of Parliament, something unprecedented was unfolding. King Charles III had requested an urgent private meeting with Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and the usual formalities were nowhere to be seen. This wasn't a scheduled appointment. This wasn't a casual discussion over tea. This was a direct confrontation, and everyone in Westminster could feel the weight of what was about to happen. Sources inside Parliament described the scene as absolutely electric. Staff members who had worked in these corridors for decades said they had never witnessed anything like it. The King arrived earlier than expected, his demeanour completely different from his usual composed, diplomatic presence. There was determination in his eyes, a sense of urgency that couldn't be ignored. He wasn't there to exchange pleasantries or discuss trivial matters. He was there to demand answers, and he wasn't leaving without them. Keir Starmer, who had been in a routine cabinet meeting, was pulled aside by his senior advisors. The message was clear and direct. The King wanted to see him immediately, and this couldn't wait. Witnesses say the Prime Minister's face went pale when he heard the news. He excused himself from the meeting, straightened his tie, and headed towards what would become one of the most intense conversations in recent British political history. His closest aides exchanged worried glances. They knew something serious was happening, but even they couldn't have predicted just how explosive this meeting would become. The corridors of Westminster were unusually quiet as the King made his way through. Members of Parliament who happened to be nearby stopped in their tracks. Some tried to approach, hoping for a brief word or acknowledgement, but the King's focus was singular. He moved with purpose, his security team struggling to keep pace. This wasn't the ceremonial monarch they were used to seeing at state functions. This was a king who had reached his breaking point, and he was about to make that abundantly clear. Inside the private meeting room, the atmosphere was suffocating. The door closed behind them, and for a moment there was complete silence. King Charles didn't waste time with formalities. He didn't ask Starmer to sit down or offer any of the usual courtesies. Instead, he launched directly into the heart of the matter, and what he said made the Prime Minister's blood run cold. The King spoke about broken promises, about decisions made without proper consultation, about a government that seemed to have forgotten the constitutional balance that held the nation together. Starmer tried to respond, tried to explain the government's position, but the King cut him off. This wasn't a discussion. This was a reckoning. Charles reminded the Prime Minister of his constitutional role, of the responsibilities that came with the crown, and of the fact that he had remained silent on too many issues for far too long. But that silence was over. The monarch made it clear that certain lines had been crossed. Certain decisions had been made without the proper respect for constitutional protocol, and that he could no longer stand by and watch without speaking up. The Prime Minister attempted to defend his government's actions, explaining the pressures they faced, the promises made to the electorate, the urgent need for reform in various sectors. But with every word, it became clearer that the gulf between them was wider than anyone had imagined. The King wasn't interested in political excuses or party rhetoric. He was focused on principle, on the constitutional framework that had governed Britain for centuries, and on what he saw as a dangerous erosion of that framework under the current government. What made this confrontation even more remarkable was what happened next. The King didn't just express his concerns privately and leave it at that. He made it clear that if these issues weren't addressed immediately, he would be forced to take the matter public. This was unprecedented. Constitutional monarchs traditionally work behind the scenes, offering guidance and warnings in private while maintaining a neutral public face. But King Charles was suggesting something different. He was ready to break with that tradition if necessary, ready to make his position known to the British people, ready to risk the political firestorm that would inevitably follow. Starmer was trapped. If he refused to address the King's concerns, he risked a public constitutional crisis unlike anything Britain had seen in modern times. If he gave in to the King's demands, he would be seen as weak by his own party and would face accusations of allowing the monarchy to interfere in democratic governance. There was no easy way out, no political manoeuvring that could resolve this situation cleanly. The Prime Minister was being cornered by the very institution he thought operated purely in the ceremonial realm. Outside the meeting room, word was starting to spread. Parliamentary staff whispered to one another. Security personnel exchanged knowing looks. Senior politicians began to gather in nearby corridors, sensing that something significant was happening. Nobody knew the exact details of what was being discussed behind those closed doors, but the tension was palpable. Some tried to appear busy, shuffling papers or making phone calls, but everyone was really just waiting to see what would happen when that door finally opened. Inside that room, the confrontation reached a critical point. King Charles laid out specific examples of government decisions that he believed had crossed constitutional boundaries. He talked about legislation that had been rushed through without proper consultation. He mentioned appointments that had been made without following traditional protocols. He brought up foreign policy decisions that had been taken without informing Buckingham Palace as required by constitutional convention. With each point, the list grew longer and Starmer's position became more uncomfortable. The Prime Minister tried to argue that times had changed, that the government needed to move quickly to address pressing national issues, that some of the old protocols were outdated and slowed down necessary progress, but the King wasn't buying it. He countered that constitutional frameworks existed for a reason, that they provided stability and continuity, that abandoning them in the name of efficiency was a dangerous path that could lead to unchecked government power. The debate grew more heated, voices rising, despite both men's attempts to maintain composure. What truly shocked Starmer was the depth of the King's knowledge. This wasn't a monarch who simply signed documents without reading them or attended ceremonies without understanding their significance. Charles had clearly been studying every piece of legislation, every government decision, every policy announcement. He quoted specific clauses from bills that had been passed months ago. He referenced historical precedents dating back centuries. He demonstrated an understanding of constitutional law that rivaled any legal expert in the country. The Prime Minister realised he was facing an opponent who had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. The King then raised what would become the most controversial point of the entire meeting. He questioned the government's handling of certain economic policies that he believed disproportionately affected the most vulnerable citizens. He spoke about families struggling to make ends meet, about businesses closing down, about communities being torn apart by decisions made in Westminster without understanding their real-world impact. This was dangerous territory for a constitutional monarch. Traditionally, the King stays out of policy discussions entirely. But Charles was arguing that there was a difference between political opinions and constitutional duty to speak up when government actions threatened the well-being of the people. Starmer immediately pushed back on this point. He argued that economic policy was purely within the government's remit, that the elected government had a mandate from the people to implement their programme, and that the monarchy had no place commenting on such matters. But the King had anticipated this response. He carefully explained that he wasn't questioning the government's right to make policy decisions. He was questioning whether those decisions were being made with proper consultation, with adequate consideration of their constitutional implications, and with genuine understanding of their impact on the covenant between government and people. The atmosphere in the room shifted as both men realised they were at an impasse. Neither was willing to back down completely. The King had gone too far to simply accept vague assurances and promises to do better. Starmer couldn't be seen as capitulating to royal pressure without undermining his entire government's authority. They were locked in a constitutional standoff with no clear resolution in sight. The silence that followed their heated exchange was even more uncomfortable than the argument itself. It was the King who finally proposed a way forward. But it came with conditions that made Starmer deeply uncomfortable. Charles suggested a series of regular private meetings where government decisions with constitutional implications would be discussed before implementation. He wanted greater transparency about policy decisions that affected traditional royal prerogatives. He demanded that certain appointments would require genuine consultation rather than mere notification. And most significantly, he wanted a formal review of how constitutional conventions were being interpreted and applied by the current government. The Prime Minister knew that agreeing to these terms would create serious problems within his own party. Many Labour MPs were already suspicious of the monarchy's role and would see this as unacceptable royal interference. The left wing of the party would be furious. The media would have a field day. Opposition parties would exploit it mercilessly. But refusing the king's demands could trigger an even bigger crisis. If Charles made good on his threat to go public with his concerns, the constitutional chaos that would follow could paralyse the government entirely. Starmer asked for time to consider the proposals, to consult with his senior advisers and cabinet members. But the king made it clear that time was limited. He wanted an initial response within days, not weeks. He had been patient for months, watching situations develop and hoping they would be resolved through normal channels. That patience had run out. The urgency in his voice left no doubt that he was serious about taking action if necessary. As the meeting began to wind down, both men understood that their relationship had fundamentally changed. The comfortable distance that usually exists between monarch and prime minister had collapsed. They were now in direct negotiations over the boundaries of their respective roles, over the interpretation of constitutional conventions, over the very nature of governance in modern Britain. This wasn't something that could be easily resolved or forgotten. Whatever happened next would set precedents that would echo through British politics for generations. The king stood to leave, and for the first time in the meeting, there was a moment of human connection beneath the constitutional conflict. Charles looked at Starmer directly and said something that witnesses later described as both a warning and an appeal. He reminded the Prime Minister that they both ultimately served the same people, that their disagreements were about methods and procedures rather than fundamental goals, and that finding a way forward was essential for the stability of the nation. But he also made it absolutely clear that compromise had limits and that some constitutional principles were non-negotiable. When the door finally opened and both men emerged, the change in atmosphere was immediate and obvious. Parliamentary staff who had been waiting anxiously tried to read their faces, looking for any clue about what had transpired. The king's expression was stern but composed, revealing nothing. Starmer looked visibly shaken, his usual political confidence replaced by genuine uncertainty. They shook hands formally for the benefit of those watching, but there was none of the warmth typically displayed after such meetings. The handshake was brief, almost perfunctory, and then the king departed with his security detail, leaving the Prime Minister standing alone in the corridor. Word spread through Westminster like wildfire. Within minutes, journalists were making phone calls, political analysts were being summoned for emergency briefings, and opposition leaders were demanding to know what had happened. The government's press office went into crisis mode, trying to craft a statement that would calm the situation without revealing too much. But in the age of social media and 24-hour news cycles, controlling the narrative was nearly impossible. Speculation ran rampant, with theories ranging from constitutional crisis to complete government collapse. Senior members of Starmer's cabinet were immediately called to an emergency meeting. As they filed into the room, the tension was visible on every face. The Prime Minister had to explain what had just occurred, and more importantly, what it meant for the government going forward. He laid out the king's demands and concerns, and the reaction was exactly what he had feared. Some ministers were furious, arguing that the monarchy had no right to make such demands. Others were more pragmatic, recognising that ignoring the king's concerns could lead to even bigger problems. The cabinet was deeply divided on how to respond. The Attorney General was asked to provide immediate legal advice on the constitutional implications of the situation. Could the King actually go public with his concerns? What would happen if he did? Were there legal limits to royal intervention in government affairs? The answers were complicated and unsatisfying. Constitutional conventions in Britain are largely unwritten and based on precedent and tradition. There were few clear legal boundaries, which meant the situation was even more unpredictable than anyone had hoped. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, the King was meeting with his own advisors. They warned him about the potential consequences of his confrontation with the Prime Minister. Going public with his concerns could trigger a constitutional crisis that might ultimately weaken the monarchy itself. There were those who argued he had already gone too far, that he had stepped over the line of proper royal conduct. But Charles was resolute. He had spent his entire life preparing for this role, studying constitutional history, understanding the delicate balance of power. He believed he was acting within his rights and duties as monarch, and he was prepared to face whatever consequences followed. Back at Westminster, opposition parties sensed an opportunity. Conservative leaders began preparing statements that would exploit any appearance of government weakness or constitutional impropriety. They demanded that Starmer explain what had happened in the meeting and what concessions he had agreed to. Parliamentary questions were being drafted, formal inquiries were being proposed, and the political machinery of opposition was cranking into high gear. The government's political opponents weren't going to let this opportunity pass without extracting maximum political damage. The media frenzy intensified with each passing hour. Every major news outlet was running special coverage. Constitutional experts were being interviewed non-stop, but though most admitted they were operating in unprecedented territory. Historical precedents were being examined and debated. Comparisons were being made to previous conflicts between monarchs and governments, though none quite matched the current situation. The public was fascinated and concerned in equal measure, with social media exploding with opinions ranging from strong support for the King to demands for abolishing the monarchy entirely. Within the Labour Party itself, tensions were reaching a breaking point. The left wing of the party saw this as confirmation of their worst fears about the monarchy as an institution. They argued that no unelected hereditary figure should have any power to question or constrain a democratically elected government. Emergency motions were being prepared for party meetings. Some MPs were openly discussing whether Starmer should simply refuse the King's demands and let the constitutional chips fall where they may. The party was fracturing along old ideological fault lines that many thought had been healed. Starmer found himself in an impossible position. Whatever decision he made would alienate significant portions of his support base. If he accommodated the King's demands, he would be seen as weak and subservient to an undemocratic institution. If he defied the King, he risked triggering a constitutional crisis that could paralyse government and create national instability. There was no clear path forward that didn't involve significant political damage and personal cost. International observers were watching the situation with intense interest. Other constitutional monarchies around the world were studying the confrontation carefully, wondering if similar tensions existed in their own systems. Republics were using the situation as evidence for their own systems of government. The British situation was becoming a test case for the viability of constitutional monarchy in the 21st century. The stakes had grown far beyond a simple disagreement between two individuals. As the day wore on, pressure mounted from all sides. The government needed to issue some kind of statement, but every draft was rejected as either too weak or too provocative. The opposition was preparing for emergency debates in Parliament. The media was demanding answers, and through it all, the question everyone was asking remained unanswered. What exactly had King Charles said to Keir Starmer that had caused such an unprecedented reaction? The details of that private conversation were still secret, but their effects were rippling through every level of British society.